I'm Chance Storland, and this is The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. And as always, I'm joined now by San Antonio Express News course reporter Elizabeth Zavala. Great to have you back here on the program, Liz. We have, I believe, at least 3 different cases that we're going to touch on today. What are we starting off with?
Yes, Chance, it's great to be back. It's been busy at the courthouse lately, considering that summer has just begun. So I wanted to update you on the David Villarreal trial. He was accused of killing his boyfriend and drug supplier, Aaron Estrada, when both men were 29 years old. Because Villarreal had said he killed his boyfriend in self-defense because he testified that he was paranoid from smoking methamphetamine, and he believed Estrada was secretly recording him with hidden cameras inside the apartment. They ended up having this fight, and Estrada ended up being stabbed 7 times, and he died at the scene. Well, the jurors heard this trial for almost a week, and gosh, Chance, they weren't playing around. It took this jury less than an hour to find David Villarreal guilty of murder. And then after the court listened to family members on both sides, it only took this jury 30 minutes to sentence Villarreal to 60 years in prison in the death of his boyfriend. So he's going to have to serve at least half of that time, 30 years, before he is eligible for parole.
That's very quick. Was that a surprise to you at all? Or, as someone who's been covering this case, was it rather cut and dry for the jury?
With juries, that is a favorite question of a lot of people. And it's one that, it always amazes me. You never know how long a jury is going to take to decide in a case. Now, sometimes the case can be so horrific that, you're thinking, gosh, this has got to be a slam dunk. And sometimes, it ends up taking a couple of hours. I've been involved with juries where it's taken a couple of days. In fact, the case we discussed most recently, the Gable Moreno, the dismemberment case, that jury, if you recall, deliberated for about, maybe 3 or 4 days before they decided they could not reach a decision. So that case ended in a mistrial. But this jury, I can tell you, I was not prepared for them to come back so soon. And a lot of the journalists covering it weren't either. And I believe we had to wait, certainly for the sentencing, 30 minutes, we had to wait for attorneys to get back to the court. So, that was definitely a surprise, definitely a testament to those jurors who paid attention and were able to follow the law exactly.
So that's one case down, 2 more to talk about. Where are we heading now, Elizabeth?
Well, this is a case I don't believe we've discussed before. This is a tragic tale of a former HEB executive who is credited with coming up with a concept of central market. His name is John Morgan Campbell. He was indicted in November of 2016 on 53 counts of possession and promotion of child pornography. He was 67 years old at that time. And he was fired after he admitted attaching a photo of a naked boy to a business email that went to another employee in April of 2014. Well, this past January, Campbell went to trial, and Bexar County jury found him guilty on 48 counts of possession of child pornography and not guilty on 5 counts of possession. And the jury heard his case, but he elected to be sentenced by State District Judge Catherine Torres Stahl, who assessed a 10-year prison term in January. Well, last week, Campbell went to court with his attorney, and he was seeking to be put on shock probation. Now, shock probation, under the Texas Code of Criminal Procedure, this provision allows a judge to send a defendant to prison or jail temporarily, then return that person to court for a sentence of community supervision. So he was sentenced in January. So, he served, I want to say maybe, about 180 days in jail at least. So his attorney, Robert Maurer, appeared before Judge Stahl last week in court. And he called a sex addiction therapist who testified that Campbell's January trial at Campbell's January trial, and where he vowed to maintain close contact should Campbell be released and put on community supervision. And the defense also called Campbell's wife, who told the judge that she would support her husband's ongoing treatment, because before there was a bit of time before Campbell he was out on bond before he went to trial, and he had testified. Witnesses had testified in his January trial that he had gone through several. It sounded kind of like he had hit this scared straight moment and got to counseling and really started addressing what he says made what happened happen. So basically, he's saying that he's a sex addict and an alcoholic, and he appeared before the judge and told the judge that alcohol was what really moved him to what he called the darkest place you could imagine with the internet. And appearing in court, he talked about his faith and keeping up with what he had started with therapy and that sort of thing. And he also told Judge Torres Stahl that if released, he would use his life experiences to help others who were suffering from addictions such as his. And he recognized that he had lost his career, which I said he was credited with coming up with the central market concept, which for HEB is their top of the notch tiered store. And that career came to a screeching halt after he was convicted. So at this hearing, this was a pre-sentencing investigation hearing. Prosecutor Patrick Ballantyne argued against shock probation because of the gravity of the case. And he told media after Judge Torres Stahl decided that he would serve the term that she assessed to him, he was going to stay in prison, 10 years on 6 counts of the promotion of child pornography and 8 years on 42 counts of possession of child pornography. So after Judge Torres Stahl told him, you're going to go back to prison, Patrick Ballantyne told journalists afterward that this case, he described it as an active promotion of child pornography. He said there were images that were sent to other people, and the additional evidence showed that he was engaged in sexually explicit communications online with people that he thought were minors, basically. So Ballantyne said, when you commit that kind of offense, he said, and the quote was, there needs to be a custodial prison sentence, not probation. So Judge Torres Stahl appeared to agree with that. And so Campbell is probably going to have to serve, at least I was, anywhere between 2 to maybe 5 years on the minimum, if not the entire 10 for this particular conviction.
You're listening to The Docket, a new weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com, brought to you by our sponsor, the law offices of Pat Maloney. Yeah, that's a difficult case to discuss, Elizabeth. So thank you for providing that update there. Interesting sentencing request and denied, as you pointed out. We do have some time left. We have a good chunk of time left. So let's get to our third case that we're going to discuss, which is really great to do. Sometimes we'll focus just on one case, oftentimes one or two, but today we're doing three. What's our third case that we can talk about today?
Well, Chance, this is definitely a good case to talk about, to spend the majority of our time with. We talked about two other defendants who have gone to prison. This was this horrific child abuse case from 2016 that involved two children, a 4-year-old boy and a 3-year-old girl, who were horribly tied up with dog chains and dog leashes and left outside for what authorities believe could have been several days in April of 2016. And these children were they were bound and tied so tightly that they were surrounded by their own feces. The little girl, who was 3 years old at the time, suffered, tremendously. They both suffered tremendously from this abuse. And now their biological mother has been sentenced in this case. Cheryl Reed was sentenced to 10 years in prison by Judge Laura Parker. And Cheryl Reed had been charged with injury to a child and child abandonment after Bexar County Sheriff's deputies found these two kids in the 8100 block of Chipping in a subdivision called Camelot 2. And this is in far northeast Bexar County. This is why the Sheriff's Department responded to this particular call. And just to remind you about this, the deputies found these children when they answered a call from a neighbor who reported hearing a child cry for several hours. And, this was late April, but it was still a little chilly. Anybody who's lived in San Antonio knows, around at least April or May, we're going to get one nice little crisp, front that'll come in. It'll bring, rain. Sometimes it'll bring hail. And when they arrived, they saw these two children tied by the ankles and the wrists. And then they also had injuries on their little bodies that were in several stages of healing. And the deputies also found 6 other children between the ages of 10 months old to 11 years old that were left alone inside the house. Now, we have already seen Portia Phillips and DeAndre Dortch, common law marriage. They were both convicted of injury to a child, serious bodily injury, and by omission. And Portia Phillips was sentenced to 50 years in prison for her role in this abuse case. And DeAndre Dortch was sentenced to 65 years. Also, injury to a child, serious bodily injury by omission, and also child abandonment. They lived in the house and they were friends with Cheryl Reed. And Cheryl Reed was in California, and she had asked them to take care of her 2 kids because she was a god sister to Portia Phillips. So she brought her kids down, and then she left them here for a couple of months. And What we heard at Cheryl Reed's hearing late Friday was that Cheryl and DeAndre had grown frustrated because she left her children and was supposed to be sending money and was supposed to be on her way back to San Antonio to pick them up. But several months had gone by, and attorneys arguing the case made their case that Portia Phillips and DeAndre Dortch were primarily responsible for the abuse of these two children. And of course, at Cheryl Reed's sentencing, she was sentenced to 10 years on 2 counts of abandonment of a child without the intent to return. Now, that is a third-degree felony. And she's been in jail for a while, and she is probably going to have, I would say, probably maybe about a year or two of credit for time served. It's unclear when she's going to be able to come up for parole. But Chance, I have to tell you that this story, during the trial of Portia Phillips and DeAndre Dortch, which were done separately, and actually Portia Phillips had reached a plea agreement, so she basically just had a sentencing hearing. DeAndre Dortch went to trial. So at DeAndre Dortch's trial, we learned that Cheryl Reed's children, the boy was 4 at the time, and the girl was 3. They both went into foster care, and a woman adopted both of them together, and not a woman and her husband, and not just the 2 children who were part of this abuse case, but also the child that Cheryl Reed had while she was in Bexar County Jail awaiting her sentencing. So a lovely woman by the name of LaKenya Shaw gave just an amazing victim impact statement at DeAndre Dortch's trial that brought the man to tears before he was led away in handcuffs. And she did the same thing at Cheryl Reed's hearing, and she handed the bailiff a photograph of Cheryl Reed's 3 children so that Reed could take that with her when she goes to prison. And I'm here to tell you, after seeing those horrific photographs of those 2 children during the trial and during the hearings, that it was just a lovely sight to see 3 really beautiful, smiling, healthy children dressed for picture day in this photograph that hopefully Cheryl Reed will be able to take with her. And Miss Shaw told Reed during her victim impact statement, she just basically wanted to reassure her that she and her husband were raising her children with lots of love and in a faith-filled home, and that they were very happy and that they were very healthy. And the last thought that she left with Cheryl Reed as she put her hands to her face and cried was Miss Shaw told her that she couldn't imagine how it felt for her to lose her children. But she said again to Cheryl Reed that her children were full of love, were full of life, and full of faith. And she told her that 10 years isn't that long, and that she was going to let the children decide whether or not they would pursue to have a relationship with her. And the last things that she said to Cheryl Reed was, and I quote, "You won't be completely forgotten." And Chance, let me tell you, there was not a dry eye in that courtroom when that happened.
I can only imagine, Elizabeth, just listening to you now, there might not be a dry eye amongst the 2 of us.
Right.
Yeah. So, I mean, Three different cases that we discussed today. As you pointed out, what a case to end on. A very, tragic case. And we've talked about this, I believe, several different times in the past that you can check out by subscribing to the docket in Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, TuneIn, or at expressnews.com/podcast. And of course, we have what sounds like to be the final update, at least legally, when it comes to this incident that happened some time ago. But as you just alluded to, in the future, there might be a different situation involving the relationship of the people involved and these children who, what you just mentioned, are probably in a very good place. I think most people would say a better place, and they seem to be in a very good place for the near future as well.
Yes, they just look so happy in that photograph. It was a great way to end the week, let me tell you.
Well, Elizabeth, I'm going to say that's a great way to end today's episode of The Docket. So as always, great to have you here on the program. We'll talk to you here in about another 7 days.
Take care.
And a big thank you to San Antonio Express News courts reporter Elizabeth Zavala for joining me for today's episode of The Docket, our weekly interview program covering law and crime in San Antonio from expressnews.com. Brought to you today by the law offices of Pat Maloney. For the San Antonio Express News, I'm Chance Dorland.